Okay. Can you maybe give some background on why there had to be the existence of both male and female species for human beings, for other animals, from maybe a practical view and maybe from a deeper view?
Why there have to be two sexes in mammals?
Maybe just the concept of male and female.
Concept of male and female. A lot of different ways to attack this. Since I'm a philosopher, let me try starting philosophically. You want to have a picture of how the world works. You'd like the picture to help you explain why things happen, and predict how they happen, and control how they happen. There are lots and lots of different things which do different things. So one main drive is to simplify things. Let's say, for example, the periodic table. How many different kinds of substances are there? Substances. Solid, liquids, and gases, and among the solids you have stone and glass and plastic and rubber sheets and diamond. Now, one thing to do is just look around and experiment with things and make a list of what they do. That's useful. Because if you need something to do a job, or you come across something and you need to know what it does, the list will tell you. But it doesn't do anything to explain why they do that. And usually doesn't give you a lot of control over what they do. So one way is to try to take things apart into their pieces. You hope that what the conglomerate does can be defined and predicted on the basis of the pieces. It doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing in logic that requires it to be that way. The opposite is what people call emergent properties. But it seems like to a great extent in our world it is that way. Now if you take, let's say, a piece of plastic, you take it apart into its pieces, you find out that this piece of plastic's ultimate building blocks are 274 different pieces, and each piece has multiple properties which operate in subtle ways. You might think of giving up. So what you get, it doesn't simplify it, doesn't give any clear, intuitive picture. Yeah, you can make a list of them, like you make a list of odd substances. You make a list of all the pieces, and make a list of all of what they do, and you have a gigantic calculator. You can't calculate it anyway. You can't even solve the three-body problem with a calculator. But it doesn't turn out that way. Well, it was supposed not to turn out that way. It was supposed to be that things are composed of pieces, and the pieces are reasonably simple. And there are only a few. In the 20s, when they were discovering atoms, there was a short period of time in which they thought there are only two building blocks of the entire universe. That's the proton and the electron. That's it. The proton's in the center in the nucleus, and the electrons are going around, and that's the end of the story. Everything is just combinations of that. That's a gigantic improvement in understanding. Now, combinations are complicated, and there are lots of them, billions and trillions and quadrillions in a peanut, and and calculate what they do. But your understanding becomes greatly enhanced, and since it's more and more and more the same stuff, with greater computing power, you can predict what greater concentration of these things will do. So the goal is to reduce things to simple building blocks. Now, a simple building block, conceptually, is a building block that does one thing. If I have to say that what's running the show is a thing that does 6 different jobs on different occasions, and sometimes there's combinations of jobs at the same time, and so on and so on, then I want an explanation for it. It won't be a good starting point to get explanations for everything else, because it'll be a mystery how it does all those things, and what governs the fact that it does sometimes and not others, and how it combines the functions. So what you really would like to get down to is things that are simple. And then you want combinations, and you'd like to be able to describe how the combinations work, so as to find out how more complex things will work on the basis of combinations of simple elements. That's, as again, there's no guarantee it has to work, but our world seems to work that way, and it's definitely, intellectually, very satisfactory if it does work that way. Now, the way that Akadosh Baruch Hu set up the world, the way the world functions in many different dimensions, it's a kind of isomorphism from dimension to dimension, where they're built out of similar elements, even though the way the elements express themselves in different areas is very different. But this isomorphism means there's an identity of form. Just to give you a rough example of this, think of music, think of the notes that are produced by the instrument in the air that you hear, and paper music, where it's notation. The notes in the air that your ear picks up are very, very different from the pieces of paper in which you have black marks. But there's the isomorphism. For every sound, there's a mark. For every mark, there's a sound. And the marks on the piece of paper tell you what sounds have to be made. So you got music on the paper and music in the air, and it's the same piece. In some sense, it's really the same piece. So here you have also a kind of structure, and this structure works in many different dimensions, and there's an analogy between what the pieces are and how they work in the various different dimensions. So if you learn one structure, you get to apply it over and over again to get understanding in many different dimensions. Now, the basic structure of combination is, dare I say it, a trinity. There is a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. This was Hegel's philosophy, which was kind of offshoot of Christianity, where trinities are big deals, as you know. And the idea is this: you have a principle which represents a kind of value or mode of action, and it's very largely uniform and has a certain direction. Then corresponding to it is another one which is also uniform, but in a certain sense opposite, standing at the opposite end of a scale. When you look at the two of them, what you see is that each one is simple and uniform, so it makes it easy to understand. But because it's simple and uniform, because it will be applied to life, and life is very complicated, each one of the simple ones is going to be out of step with what's needed, because it's simple. So the first thing you do is you have the thesis and the antithesis, which in some sense have to work together. It could be alternative, or they could combine efforts to provide a kind of amalgamated effect. This gives room for a certain amount of flexibility.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I'll give an example in a minute. And then there's a possibility of a richer union where you create a synthesis out of the two principles, and the synthesis is more like a chemical combination than it is like just a mixture or a hand-in-hand partnership. And then you get the trio, and then you have pure A and pure B, where they're opposed to one another, and sometimes you have A and B working together in certain ways, and then you have C, which is made out of A and B, and which has a much richer mode of operation. But since it's made out of A and B, you get the explanation for it on the basis of the purity and simplicity of A and B. It's just that C is a complex thing made out of A and B, and then you have the trio working together. And that's the basic structure. And then you have these trios on different levels, with somewhat different, how shall I say, somewhat different spheres of activity. But it's the same trio relationship in each case, just applied in a different area. Here, if you know the Hebrew, be very careful because there are trios of terms which sound the same and they're utterly, utterly different. You have the 10 seros, so you have Chachma, Bina, and Das. By the way, you can call it a segel because that's what it is. It's 2 dots and another dot in the middle. Chachma, Bina, and Das is a trio. Chesed, Gvur, and Tiferes is a trio. Netzachot, Yesod is a trio, and they're related in the way these trios are. They're just on different levels. Then there's a term, Chesed, Din, V'Rachamim. That sounds a lot like Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. Gvura and Din are certainly related. Rachamim, Tiferes, but it's not the same at all. Chesed, Din, V'Rachamim is the name for the abstract triangle shape. Chabad is a Chadar, Chagas is a Chadar, Nehi is a Hadar. They're all Hadars. Hadar is a
Hadar is a trio?
It's Chesed, Din, and Rachamim.
Oh, okay.
So Chadar is an abstract term which refers to the triangle shape.
Oh, okay.
And then, let's say Chesed, Gvur, and Tiferes is one of the triangle shapes. Even though the terms overlap, but it's on a much different level of description. Now, in basic terms, Chesed gives and Din withholds. So they are opposites, and there's obviously tension between the two of them. And Rachamim is a very subtle chemical combination of Chesed and Din. Let me explain what I mean by a chemical combination. If you take your coffee and put milk in and stir it, you now have a mixture of coffee and milk. If you take sugar and put it in warm water, eventually it will evaporate. It will dissolve, and it will spread throughout the water. The water will taste sweet. Those are physical combinations. You take hydrogen and oxygen and put them together the appropriate way, you get water. That's a chemical combination. Hydrogen and oxygen are gases, and water is not a gas, it's a liquid. That's a dramatic, dramatic change. When the atoms make new molecules, the properties of the substance change dramatically. So, Rachamim, as the third element in the trio, that's like hydrogen and oxygen becoming water. When you have Chesed and Din, the Chesed wants to give, the Din wants to withhold. They could alternate, or you could give half. The Chesed sort of sending out. The Din says, "I'll let half through, and I won't let the other half through." That's a kind of mechanical cooperation between the two of them. But when you come to the Rachamim in the middle, it's not mechanical. It's not Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday Chesed, Monday, Wednesday, Friday Din, and the Shabbos you take a rest. No. It's something much more subtle than that. Much more subtle than that. Now, in this trio, male and female play the roles of Chesed and Din. And here, I have to be very, very careful not to make a confusion. This is something that my oldest son, who got into the material earlier than I did, and knows it much better than I do, pointed out to me to be very careful about this. When you talk about, let's say, one is a giver and one is a receiver, don't confuse that with active and passive. Listen again. A gives to B, B receives from A. That says nothing about active and passive. Active and passive is a question of who initiates the interaction and who responds. And very often, the recipient can initiate the action. And the giver responds by giving. And indeed, from our point of view, when you have the male and female, where the male is giving and the female is receiving, and the relationship between, let's say, the Jewish people and God is such a relationship, where He gives and we receive, the highest, most complete, most ideal interaction is where the receiver initiates the action. Called Serusta de la Sata.
It's higher than. It's higher?
Yeah, it's higher, more important, more complete, more ideal, more perfect, when the recipient initiates the action.
For both the woman and for the Jewish people, even with respect to the husband and to God?
Yes, that's right, although the initiation on the part of the woman has to be subtle.
Okay.
Has to be subtle. So, now, to say there's giver and receiver means to say there's something that's transferred. And that's something that's described in the literature in detail. But that's the first relationship. The first relationship is a giver and a receiver working together. Everything that happens, whether it's God performing it, or nature, so to speak, performing it, or human beings doing it, everything that happens is a combination of male and female. Everything. Never is it only male, never is it only female. Nothing that's only male or female could exist, nor could it operate.
These are like the first two members of the triad, you're saying?
That's right. That's right. Now,
Wait, God can't be an A?
so from this point of view, I'm speaking the language of Kabbalah now, God drops out.
Okay.
Because God you can't speak about at all.
Okay.
There are modes of divine action. I think we spoke about this once. They're just modes of divine action. And some modes are male and some modes are female. When we say, before we do a mitzvah, L'Shem Yichud Kudsha Baruch Hu Shchintei, in order to unify Kudsha Baruch Hu, which means holiness, blessed is He, not the Holy One, blessed is He. Kudsha Baruch Hu in Aramaic and the Kadosh Baruch Hu in Hebrew are not synonymous. Kadosh and Kodesh are not synonymous. Kudsha in Aramaic is Kodesh, and Kadosh is what we say, Kadosh Baruch Hu, they're not synonymous. But Kudsha Baruch Hu refers to a male manifestation, male type of principle of action, and Shchintei refers to a female type of interaction. And we say we do the mitzvah l'shem yichud in order to unify the male and the female.
So,
Because
what's C?
Sorry, say again.
So what's C?
Oh, see, I'll just tell you this briefly. I worked on this for a long time, trying to figure out how to marry together chesed and din, the giving and the restricting, into a combination. And I used math, and I used science, and I used chemistry, everything else. Nothing worked. So I asked my son about it. He said, Abba, you're using Western philosophical and scientific categories to explain the Jewish idea. Not terribly surprising that you didn't find a good model. I said, that sounds reasonable.
What exactly are you trying to explain?
How Rachamim is some type of amalgamation of Chesed and Din.
Is that just a specific instance of the general problem of what is C in relation to A and B?
Well, again, Chesed, Din, and Rachamim are the abstract terms for the triangle relationship.
For all triangle relationships?
Right.
Down to like molecular interaction?
No, I'm just talking about Chabad, Chagas, and Nehi.
Okay.
Right? All the triangle relationships that the Jewish religion talks about, where it talks about specific qualities, they all have the Chadar form. The Chadar form is a giver, a receiver, and an amalgamation. But they give on different levels. One is intellectual, and one is emotional, and the other is behavioral. But there's a giver, a receiver, and an amalgamation on all the levels.
Wait, and this is only, like the Gemara expression V'mad Evrim Omrim. Like, sorry, where are the triangles limited to?
So, for example, Chabad is intellectual, Chagas is emotional, and Nehi is behavioral, active.
Okay.
But in all three cases, you have a giver, a receiver, or let's say a giver and a restrictor, and an amalgam. It's just one is on the intellectual level, one is on the emotional level, and one is on the active level.
Okay.
But there are many other different levels. This is just within the human form. It applies in nature. It applies in substances. It applies in history. There are periods of history that operate that way. It's the same form over and over and over again. A little bit like fractals.
I remember you mentioned you've listened to Jordan Peterson in the past. You've seen how he amalgamates order and chaos in the individual. Would you impose that triangular structure onto that? I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with it.
You could. I don't know whether it would smoothly fit all the details, but chaos is unstructured fruitfulness, unstructured productivity. It's chaotic because it's producing, and what it's going to produce next you don't know. So on the one hand, it's a source of vitality, and it's a source of newness. On the other hand, it's wild. It can be very destructive. Order is where you filter things, where you categorize things, where you classify things, where you set limits, up to 6 feet and no more. 6'1" over there. So order is much more like the din side, in his terms, and chaos is much more like the chesed side. It just gives, and gives indiscriminately, gives blindly, just gives. So the question is, how do you make the amalgam in the center? And the Jewish idea is the idea of or and kli. Or means light, and kli means vessel. And we have a picture of vessels containing light. Now, obviously light, by its very nature, spreads. So light is an expression of chesed, of giving and spreading and growing and providing. A vessel limits, especially if it's an opaque vessel, the light can't get out. Now you have, sort of like fire and water, right? You combine fire and water and you get usually nothing. Either the water evaporates or the fire goes out and you get nothing. The way you make them work together is you put a pot in between. Put a pot in between, and very, very important work can be done. So here, the light and the vessel have opposite properties. But imagine, for example, that the walls of the vessel are translucent. So you put the light inside, you can't see the light, but the vessel glows. And the vessel gives off light. So the light isn't totally blocked, but what you get now is a filtered light. Something you don't get from the light alone, and you don't get from the vessel alone.
Is that entity a new thing?
Yes, of course it's a new thing. A glowing pot is a new thing. The light, for example, may be so strong you can't look at it. You'll burn your eyes out. The pot is dead. You'll freeze to death on a dead planet without light. With the light in a vessel whose walls are translucent, you may have just enough light to be able to see, to be able to be warm, to be able to survive. Right?
So you mentioned that the female or the receiver is more important than the male or the giver?
No, I did not say more important. I did not say more important.
Is it higher? You said higher.
No, I didn't say it was higher. I didn't say that.
What did you say?
I didn't talk about the items. I talked about an event. I talked about an event being higher or lower. I didn't talk about the things making the event.
I guess what I'm trying to say is in the picture that you're illustrating, the light seems much more, it seems prior to the
It may be prior, but you see, every time you introduce a new word, you're changing the subject.
Okay.
Before it was events. Now it became items. Now instead of higher, you're talking about prior. Every time you do that, you're changing the subject. So you have to learn when you're starting out in a subject like this to be very picky about the vocabulary, and try as best you can not to paraphrase in your own terms,
Okay.
but try to stick with the vocabulary that's being used. Otherwise, it becomes something which can't be communicated because everything is a new subject. So I was talking before about interactions. I talked about two types of interactions. Who initiates the interaction, which makes the interaction a higher interaction. Interaction is an event. It's not a thing.
Which is
I wasn't talking about the things being higher or more complete.
I see.
And it's very important because people who do politics get this wrong on purpose in order to throw Molotov cocktails at you.
Okay.
Let's not be reticent about it.
Okay.
That's what they do. They get it wrong on purpose. They say, you think women are trash, and you think men are everything, and the ideal of men, because they want to confuse these things and not say what the picture really says.
Okay.
Right? So now, again, we're back to Rachamim. How do you combine the giver and the constrictor and receiver? How do you put them together into one thing? So, when you put the light into the vessel whose walls are translucent, you get a double benefit, at least double. One thing is, if the light was too bright to look at, the Achronim talk about this. If you want to look at the sun, you can't look at the sun. You know what they used to do? They would smoke glass. The glass was smoked. And then you would put that between you and the sun. You could look at the image of the sun through the smoked glass. Because the smoked glass blocked out 98% of the light. And the 2%, you could see it. You could see the shape of the sun. You could actually study the sun through smoked glass. So now, think carefully about this. The smoked glass makes the sun visible. It makes the sun visible by blocking most of the light. Blocking and revealing happen simultaneously. One happens because of the other. Sounds like they're opposites, but if I can't look at the sun, then the sun, its shape, its size, and so forth, it's not revealed to me. I can't look at it. By blocking most of the light, I can look at the sun. So that's a tremendous benefit for us to interact with the light. If most of it is held back, the remainder is something that I can look at directly, I can face, I can study, I can try to understand. So it reveals the character of the light to me by putting it in the vessel, which holds it back.
It's just strange. Well, this is probably very presumptuous, but it seems like what is not strange, but it's a very strange way of configuring the world to create the light in such a way that it is too bright to see, such that it needs a vessel to be contained. Like, why create it like that? Why not just make the light?
Because your ability to receive the light varies. It's not fixed. Your ability, historical periods ability, and then you allow more light to be received by changing the opacity or translucency of the walls.
Okay, so you talk.
1 second.
Sorry.
I mean, you guys are the right questions, but if you go on like this, you're not going to get any structure at all. And then you could say, well, why don't you just turn up the wattage and turn down the wattage, on the light, make the light brighter and so. No, because the light, the pure light, full strength, is the goal.
I see.
That's the purpose of the
Say
whole.
that again?
It's the goal.
The pure
It's
light?
the pure light without any filter is the goal. It's the point of the exercise. It shows the ultimate will of the one who made the system. He made the system to maximize the light. So he put in maximal light.
Oh, okay.
And then he says, well, but at your stage of, it's like saying, why do you do physics if you're going to teach 6-year-olds? Because they're not always going to be 6-year-olds. That's why.
Uh-huh.
When they get to be 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds or 20-year-olds, I'll teach them on another level.
Uh-huh.
So I study what I can use to teach the 35-year-old. But when he's 6, I teach him something less.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, I teach him that. So the original light shows you the will of the system, what the system's for. And then the vessel which retards it or reduces it, filters it, is a temporary means, so as to be able to relate to this reality. So that's one benefit, that the light becomes visible by being partially hidden. The other benefit goes back to
Benefit to what exactly?
it's a benefit to the light that is partially hidden so that it can be visible. Okay? But now, what you did say this, and I didn't pursue it before, but in a certain sense, the light's contribution is more fundamental than that of the vessel, and the vessel's existence and value is greatly elevated by the fact that it is functioning to both hide and reveal the light. The light, like again, my son says, the vessel is like saying no. No is always a response. No, it's a response to something else that's been initiated. You can't start off, no. There's no sense, right? So if there's no light, the vessel is dead. If there's no vessel, the light isn't dead. It's just too strong to be used. It overwhelms the one for whom in an interaction, but it's not dead. It's operating, it's acting. But a vessel without light is just dead. Okay. So now, by containing the light, by restricting it, by containing some of it and not letting it out, and letting other parts of it out, the vessel now becomes alive. That's what makes it alive. That's what makes it functional. That's what gives it value. So the effect of the light on the vessel is much more dramatic than the effect of the vessel on the light. And that makes the light higher than the vessel. But that's how you make the amalgam. So anyway, you asked about the sexes. The sexes are the giver and the receiver, the provider, the spreader on the one hand, and the restrictor on the other hand.
The light in the vessel?
Analogous to, but when you're talking about human beings, it's a different. It's analogous. That's right. It's analogous.
Analogous? Is there a different model?
No. But the music in the air and music on the paper are analogous to one another. But you can't listen to the paper, so it's not exactly the same.
Okay.
Right? The structure is the same. Right? But the details of how it's implemented also are part of the reality. You can't be ignorant of them. But what we're talking about is the structure, but the implementation is going to be. Right? So, and creativity in this world requires the cooperation of the two, just like it does in fertility. It's the cooperation of the two that accomplishes that. Anyway, that's why the reason we're two sexes is because there's these two principles: the principle of creating, giving, providing, distributing on the one hand, and the principle of filtering, categorizing, distinguishing, focusing, restricting, rejecting on the other hand. Those two principles work together to produce results, and sometimes they're amalgamated into a single principle on the ohr and cleat pattern. That's just 1/10 of 1% off the top. But you asked, so let's start. Yeah.
Why was idol worship such a big temptation in the past?
It's a very good question. One of the Amoraim was giving a lecture, and was talking about the King Menashe, and he spoke to him in a derogatory fashion. He said, "Our friend Menashe did this and this and this." So the king appeared to him in a dream at night, and he said, "Our friend, are we? Let's talk about law. What were you thinking about this case?" And the Amora said this, and Menashe says, "No, you're wrong. You forgot about this. You make that mistake and that mistake." So the Amora says to him, "Well, if you're so smart and you know so much Torah, how could you have worshipped idols?" And he said, "If you had been here, you'd have pulled up your garments to run to bow to the idol." The commentators say, "We bowed, but we didn't pull up our garments to run. We didn't do that. But if you had lived here, you'd have been more enthusiastic, more entrapped, more hypnotized than we are." Okay, so the Gemara tells us that at the beginning of the Second Temple, the rabbis prayed to God to take away the spirit of idol worship. Idol worship existed almost throughout the First Temple period, and it was ruinous and disastrous for the Jewish people, and we did not conquer it. We did not conquer it. And they said, we can't do this. It'll be a failure again. So God agreed. He took it away. So we don't experience that drive. We don't experience that need. Right? But, and he's saying, if you had been with us when that drive was in the world, so you would have felt it as well. So it's like, someone saying, I've heard of something called strawberries. I've never tasted. What do they taste like? Go tell him. Explain it to him, right? There's no words you can give for the taste of strawberries. Strawberries taste like strawberries. That's how they taste. Eat one and you'll know, right? But if you want an example of it, I think there's something close to it in our period of history, the last 1,000 years or so, and that is nationalism. Remember Karl Marx? The end of nations. The end of the nation state. There's going to be international identification on the basis of economic classes. The state will wither away. There won't be state organizations anymore. It's going to be an international economy. What a gigantic mistake. Only one of 16 that he made. What a gigantic mistake. What happened when the Soviet Union dissolved? Didn't remain a voluntary confederation. Every one of those states became independent. Czechoslovakia became 3 states. The spirit of the nation state is, it's got a hypnotic effect. You can't organize society other than being in a nation state. There's no other anything, no other any such thing as not being in a nation state. And there's somebody to tell you, no, it's voluntary, it's accidental, doesn't have to be that way. We could do it otherwise. Show me any group that has ever functioned that way. You don't have it. So it's that kind of grip. Now, I can explain certain analogies that might help. This is through my lens. I don't know if we really understand their culture that well, but there are certain analogies that might help. Why do things happen? What makes things happen? Well, one thing you know is how you make things happen. You make decisions and you do things. Animals also do similar things. They act. We say they don't have free will, but they act. They often have alternatives, and they act one way, the other way. These are, in some sense, agents that make things happen. Is the wind an expression of an agent? Well, let's not take the wind. Let's take the sun. The sun's behavior is very regular. What produces regularity in your world? If you arrange your papers on the desk, they're arranged. Leave them there for a while, especially if you have kids around, or the window's open and the breeze can blow through, they'll become unarranged. And you arrange them. So things that are arranged, things that are regular, things that are focused and controlled, there's something controlling them. That's how you experience it. So why should the sun be regular like that? The wind isn't regular like that. Why should the sun be regular like that? Seems like something's controlling it, and something which has consistency. Consistency is the mark of a kind of rule, a kind of goal that something is controlling and propelling. Lots of things have consistency like that. The tides have consistency like that. The course of nature, the growth and the development and the death of living creatures is very, very regular. So the natural thought is there must be something behind it. Must be something behind it that's controlling it rather than just having it go to pieces. You know? When the leaves blow off the tree in the fall, they don't fall in any particular pattern. Different times they fall in different clumps. Different trees they fall in different clumps. Different years in different clumps. So it doesn't seem to be anything behind it. That just happens for no reason whatsoever. But things that are regular seem to betray a kind of control. That's one way where you look for an agent that's behind it that makes it happen. Now, the wind isn't totally irregular. You don't have 2 months with no wind at all, and then a 7-week hurricane, and so on and so on. There are certain regularities, not totally random. So then that bespeaks some kind of control. So then you could generalize it to see something behind that. I think that polytheism is much more natural than monotheism. I think monotheism is very surprising, almost shocking. Why would you think that what goes on in the world is under one power? The way the sun behaves, and the way the tides behave, and the way the plants grow in the spring and die in the fall, and the way the wind blows aren't analogous at all. their behavior, their regularity, their force, their effect, they're not analogous at all. Why would you think there's one cause behind all of it? Would you think that there's one system that makes diamonds and sand and cauliflower and mosquitoes and walruses? You wouldn't associate those things. They're very, very different from one another. Why would you think they all came from the same factory? There's no factory that could make all of those. So the idea of there being separate powers, separate agencies that are involved in controlling these different aspects of nature is very, very natural. To somehow reach a level of abstraction where you think there's one behind it, so many things that religion has made up, very, very difficult to explain where this kind of an idea could come from. And indeed, some historians, I'm not well read in history, but I've read about it, some historians say that unity in science is motivated by monotheism. If there's one creator creating it all, then maybe there's one or a few principles behind it all. Whereas if there are separate creators, separate sources, there's no reason for them to have anything in common at all. So this idea of unifying is a dramatic, difficult, unintuitive idea, which has paid off in terms of our ability to understand things. But it's as I say, it's a dramatic and unintuitive idea. So now, as usual, I'm getting lost. I'm answering your question. What did you start with?
Why is idol worship a temptation?
Oh, so I think that if you didn't think in terms of idols, you'd be facing a world with no understanding at all. There's no way to explain what's going on. You'd be like an animal. You know, it happens, so I react. It happens, so I react. Here, you're trying to give it structure to it, where you can get some understanding of it and some way to deal with it. And of course, there's also the hope of control. If there's some kind of personality behind these powers, then you could interact with that personality. You could try to influence that personality. So I think in those respects, it's very natural. But to explain the grip that it had on people, you know, if you imagine the communist revolution ever happening, which I don't think will ever happen. As I told you, I think Marx was terrible. He's full of mistakes. But if it did happen, after a few generations, you ask people what drove the nation state, they won't be able to tell you anymore. We're so far from their experience, they won't be able to remember it anymore. And so, I'll give you another example. Maybe this will help intuitively. Yeah, I've read what historians say. The idea of a right, rights. Some say that before the Middle Ages, there was no such concept. Nowhere in the ancient world, nowhere in ancient literature do you have the concept of a right. Could be that Martin Luther invented it in order to justify his break with Rome. Rome had all the authority, and rights are an authority that inheres in every individual, not beholden to any institution, not beholden to any leader. They're inherently part of the moral stature of an individual human being. So he invented that in order to. Today, a person if you tell the person, try to think of a moral system without rights, his mind goes blank. No rights? So everything will go to pieces. It'll be chaos. It'll be anarchy. 1,000 years ago it wasn't anarchy, but he can't think himself into that space. Rights have become so deeply embedded in our way of thinking that thinking of a world without rights. So for them, idol worship was as deeply invested in them as rights are for us. And you know that 1,000 years ago there weren't any, so it's not inherent in a human being to live with the idea of rights. But our system, our culture is built on rights in such a fundamental way that we can't even imagine what it would be like without it. So I'm just giving you a way to appreciate externally what their psychology was like without giving you any real. By the way, the problem of monotheism is solved on our picture, because on our picture, the human race started with monotheism. Idol worship was a deterioration. And then there was those who held on to the original idea, and it was based on the fact that the Creator interacted with people. So it wasn't something they had to figure out on the basis of their analysis. And the idol worship was an aberration, it's a deterioration from that. So we haven't answered that question, but the others, how it supposedly evolved, evolved is that magical word. Merchants will say it happened, but you want to pledge allegiance to evolution to show your green card, So you say it evolved, but no one has a clue how the ideas really took hold. Ja, was noch? It's Q&A. You have a question?
Someone asked me a question. I didn't answer the best answer.
Sure.
He asked me what was the purpose of the world.
What I can't hear?
The purpose of God created the world. So I answered him something that a lot of people answer, then because he wants to create good. So then he said, well, if you go to the hospital and you see somebody connected to pipes, he's going to say, oh God, thank you very much. I know it's good, well, no, thank you.
Well, there are a few things you could say. When you'll have children, you may come to a stage where, when it's dinner time, and the child comes in to eat dinner, you will require him to wash his hands. Let's say he's 5. The kid says, this is a pain in the neck. I'm hungry. Food's on the table. Why do I have to wash my hands? What have you got against brown, Dad? Brown bother you? Does it push your buttons? Is it a trigger for you? Right? So the father, if the kid thinks he's smart, the father says, if you don't wash, there are things on your hands that you can't see that'll make you sick. And the kid says, uh-oh. My father believes in invisible things that make you sick. Oh man, could I be transferred? Could I be adopted? My father believes in invisible things that make you sick. Right? And the kid may have no patience, they may throw a tantrum, as children do, so forth and so on. Do you expect when he's 13 and he learns about bacteria that he'll thank you at 13?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Give yourself a chance to digest the point. So are you really doing something good for him when he's 5?
Yeah.
Even though at 5 he would say, no thank you. It's still good even if now he says no thank you. So if you ask the guy with the pipes in the hospital, do you want this? Do you not want this? If he says no thank you, that's no reason to think that it's not good what's happening to him. He doesn't like it, but that doesn't mean it isn't good. That's one way to answer that objection. Objection is superficial because it takes my preference at the moment to be the criterion of whether it's good for me or not. And that's not a good criterion.
So this kid's saying, okay, you're dad, you know about this bacteria because you created this bacteria. How come you can't show me in my age that there's really bacteria there, and it's really bad? If you're so good, why can't you make me see that what you're doing is really good? Why do I have to believe that it's good, and that's what actually...
Well, the short answer is that you are not living in the world the way God made it. God didn't make babies. God made adults. And he did let them see. And they did know. That's how God made it. They failed. The world changed its structure because of their failure. The change is designed to overcome the destructiveness in the failure. But if you're talking about God's programming of the world, He didn't make a world in which there are babies that have to take it on faith. He didn't make that world.
He said, it wasn't my fault that Adam did whatever he did.
It's okay. So first of all, notice that I have answered 2 questions. You're going on to a 3rd question. I don't mind. Let's keep it on record that you asked 2 questions, and I gave 2 answers, and you're not challenging the answers. You're asking a further question. Why should it be that way?
Ralph said that God created a perfect people once they changed it. I thought that Ralph was saying that basically Adam was referring to the change because Adam changed.
That's right. I understand, but I want you to be registered that your question it's not designed to show that my answer was inadequate. It's just that it leads to another question. Because people go through this and they use this type of interaction, tone of interaction, and they walk away. See, he didn't answer me anything, but that's just false. Okay, now you want to know why, if he failed, I have to suffer. The Jewish answer is because we were all there. We are slices of Adam's soul, and we all participated in the failure, and we are living out the results of our own participation. That's number 3 that's answered. So there are ways to make sense out of this system. I was talking to somebody about this many years ago. I was giving an answer. He said, gee, it seems to be a pretty well thought out system. I said, yeah, some bright people working on it for 3,000 years. And they've done some good work. Yeah, but I appreciate the desire to continue to ask, but I think you mislead yourself if you don't realize that you asked 3 questions and each question got an answer. Your further question doesn't invalidate the answer to the previous question. It's just something else that comes up that needs to be explained, right? And there's lots of things that need to be explained.
Okay, so there's another question. So he's saying, well, this looks like someone's playing a computer game. You know, these computer games, they can sit there and create stuff, make a town. What's the point of all this crazy board? Like, why is he making this ball, small ball? All these people, what's the whole purpose of the game?
Well, to give a rough analogy to start, what's the purpose of putting kids through school? Memorizing the multiplication table and memorizing the continents and learning how to solve an equation and so forth and so on. Because you say later on, you're going to have opportunities to do things that will be precious to you at that time, and this preparation is what makes you able to do those things. So, to a certain extent, there's a word which the Christians made a great deal of, is faith. We have a word, emunah. I think the right definition of emunah is rational trust. You have to be able to trust. You should have reason for trusting, but you have to be able to trust. If you're not able to trust, you can't survive. If you can't trust the doctor to tell you how to cure your illness, you'll die of the illness, and your life will be short and painful. Now, doctors have to pass exams, and they have to be certified, and so forth and so on, so there may be a reason to trust them. But if you can't trust, so you have to be taught how to trust and how to learn when to trust and when not to trust. That's a fundamental part of your life skills as a human being. And going through childhood and knowing at the outset you depend upon your parents for everything. And then from time to time you catch your parents in a mistake and you think, well, I depend upon them for everything. But then sometimes, and then you have to make a balance, and you learn over years how to make that balance. And smart parenting, we tell parents, never lie to your children. Never. Another cookie! We're out of cookies. And when the parent's not looking, he climbs up on the couch and he opens it up. Oh, there are cookies there. He just didn't give it to me. Never lie to your children. Because you sacrifice your credibility. When a child asks a question, answer, if you can at all. The answer should be true, but minimal. We were driving past a cemetery, and one of the kids looked out and said, what are all those stones doing in the field there? So I said, that's the place where they collect stones. So my wife gave me a kick, because she taught me this. And she said, that's what happens to people after they die. That's all. That they dig a hole, and the worms eat the body, and it disintegrates and decays. No. That's what happens to people. What happens? Let the kid decide. whether he can handle war or not. If that's enough for him, he'll stop. If he asks the next question, give minimal pieces of information, but true pieces of information, so that when they check it out, it turns out to be correct, then you don't sacrifice your credibility. But the child has to learn, and then he'll learn in categories. My father's wonderful about politics, and he's terrible about chemistry. So, okay, so I don't want to have a chemistry, but that doesn't mean I distrust him in politics. I've learned to distinguish where he's trustworthy, where he isn't. That's a crucial life skill. Because if you're not able to trust, you're not going to be able to survive. So this is one of the things that goes on in this kind of interaction. Okay, these are intelligent questions. I'll just go back and say what I said before, and I have to go teach somebody else. The question is, what is the point of the questioning? What is the questioner trying to do? Is he trying to gain information, or in his own mind is he trying to prove that it's false?
I'm trying to get information.
I know you are, but you're reporting somebody else's questions, right?
Yeah.
And the question is, and the difference will show in his tone of voice. And the vocabulary will always be, yeah, but. And the word but means, I have a reason that I don't have to accept what you said. And then the but will really be something new, something else. Because he doesn't want to admit that you said something to him that really answered his question, because he wants to prove that it's false. That's his goal in asking the questions. So I think that's dishonest, and it's injurious to him as well as it is to the discussion, because in fact, if he gets an answer, it ought to be registered that it is an answer, and then go to other questions by all means, but don't pretend that it wasn't an answer. You're cheating yourself out of gaining understanding if you do that.